The words landed in the middle of the Gold Spur Saloon like a bullet fired into still water, sending ripples through every person who heard them. I came back for one reason. Della Wells stood behind the bar with a whiskey glass frozen in her hand, her knuckles gone white around the rim, her breath caught somewhere between her chest and her throat. The whole room had gone the particular kind of quiet that only happens when something monumental is about to occur, when the air itself seems to understand that the next few seconds will divide a life into before and after. Grant Bancroft stood in the doorway. 2 years. 2 years of silence. 2 years of empty mornings and nights she had filled with work and more work, scrubbing glasses until they shone, keeping the books for her father's saloon, telling herself the hollow feeling in her chest was something she would eventually stop noticing. 2 years of hearing nothing, not a letter, not a message carried by a passing rider, not even a rumor drifting through Caldwell, Kansas on the hot summer wind. And now he was here. He was taller in her memory, or maybe the same height, but the years had done something to him. There was a stillness about Grant Bancroft that had always unnerved people, a quietness that men with loud mouths and louder guns never quite knew what to make of. He wore it differently now. The stillness had deepened, settled into his bones the way a river eventually carves its bed into stone. He wore a dark canvas duster that was gray with trail dust, a battered hat pulled low, and beneath the shadow of its brim his eyes found her immediately. They always found her immediately. Gray eyes. She had tried to forget the exact color of them. She had failed at that particular task every single day for 730 days. The room waited. Every cowboy, every drifter, every card player and barkeep, and painted lady in the Gold Spur Saloon held their collective breath. They all knew the story, or the version of it that gossip had turned into something half-legend. They knew that Grant Bancroft had ridden out of Caldwell 2 years ago under a cloud of whispered accusations, dark secrets, and a betrayal so layered and complex that even those who'd witnessed parts of it still argued about what had really happened. They knew that Della Wells had watched him go and had not called after him. They also knew, if they were honest with themselves, that she had regretted it every day since. "You have some nerve," Della said, and her voice came out steady, which surprised her because her hands were trembling. She set the glass down carefully on the bar before it could slip, walking in here like no time has passed. Grant stepped inside. The door swung shut behind him. He moved the way he always moved, with that unhurried deliberateness that made people unconsciously step back, not because he was aggressive, but because there was something in his presence that demanded space. He stopped a few feet from the bar. "I know it has," he said. His voice was low, roughed with trail dust and something else, something raw and careful all at once. 2 years. I know exactly how long it's been, Della. The sound of her name in his mouth did something violent to the composure she had been holding on to. "Then you know," she said, "that whatever reason you've come back for, it is almost certainly 2 years too late." She saw something move behind his eyes, a flash of pain so quick and honest that it cut through her anger before she could defend against it. "Maybe," he said, "but I had to come back and find out." Around them, the saloon began to breathe again. A card player coughed. Someone shifted in a chair. The piano player in the corner, a young man named Abe who had the good sense to read a room, quietly took his hands off the keys and found something interesting to study on the floor. Della came around the bar. She did not entirely know why. Her feet carried her forward on some instinct older than the anger, older than the grief, and she stopped in front of Grant Bancroft with 3 feet of space and 2 years of silence between them. "Then say it," she said quietly. "Say the one reason." He looked at her for a long moment. The room was very still. "You," he said. "The one reason is you." She had told herself, on the nights when she was honest with herself, that if he ever came back and said something like that, she would feel relief, or joy, or the clean resolution of a wound finally healing. She had not expected to feel the specific and devastating combination of fury and longing that rose through her like floodwater, because the wanting and the hurt were not separate things. They were the same feeling wearing two different faces. "That," she said, "is the beginning of a very long conversation." She turned and walked toward the back door that led to the kitchen and the quiet room where her father kept the accounts. After a beat, she looked back over her shoulder. "Well," she said, "are you coming?" He followed her. Of course he followed her. He had crossed 400 miles of Kansas prairie and Indian territory for this exact moment. He was not going to stop at the threshold. The back room of the Gold Spur Saloon was small and practical, holding a scarred oak desk, 2 chairs, a coal oil lamp that threw amber light across walls covered in ledger pages, and a single, faded broadside that advertised a cattle drive from 5 years ago. Della sat behind the desk, which was a tactical decision she made consciously, because she needed the distance, and the desk gave her something to hide her shaking hands under. Grant took the other chair without being invited. He set his hat on his knee and ran a hand through his hair, which was longer than she remembered, dark and shot through at the temples with the earliest suggestion of silver, though he could not have been more than 32. It was not age that had put those threads of silver there, she suspected. It was whatever the last 2 years had been. "Before you say anything else," Della said, "I need you to understand something. I am not the same woman who stood on that street corner and watched you ride out without an explanation. I have spent 2 years building something here, running this place, keeping it solvent when half the businesses in Caldwell were folding. I have been self-sufficient and I have been fine. So whatever you think you rode back here for, you need to understand that I am not someone who simply picks up where she left off because the other party decided to return." Grant listened to all of this without interruption. That had always been one of the things about him that simultaneously comforted and frustrated her. He listened completely. He did not prepare his response while she was talking. He actually heard every word. "That's fair," he said when she finished. "Every word of that is fair." "Then explain," she said. "Start from the beginning, the real beginning, not the version you let everyone believe." He was quiet for a moment. Then he leaned forward in the chair, put his elbows on his knees, and began to talk. The real beginning, as it turned out, started not 2 years ago but 4, in a town called Dodge City, before Grant had ever come to Caldwell. He had ridden into Dodge in the spring of 1880 as a hired gun for a cattle operation called the Meridian Land Company, owned by a man named Harlan Voss. Harlan Voss was the kind of man who wore wealth like armor. He owned land, livestock, a bank interest, and a web of obligations that stretched across 3 counties. He had a talent for making men feel they owed him something, and a particular gift for creating situations where the debt was never quite repaid. Grant had been 28, skilled with a gun in the way that some men are skilled with a tool they have worked with long enough that it becomes extension of instinct, and short on better options. He had ridden for Voss for 8 months, doing the kind of work that kept the Meridian operation running, which mostly meant standing in doorways looking resolute, accompanying land agents when they visited homesteaders who had not paid their leases, and occasionally providing a presence that encouraged cooperation. He had not, he was careful to tell Della, raised his gun at an innocent person. He had not needed to. The reputation was usually enough. But he had been part of a machine that had used fear as currency, and he had known it, and he had let it continue because the pay was good, and he had not yet developed the particular kind of moral courage required to walk away from comfort toward principle. What had eventually made him walk away was a woman named Clara Voss. Della's expression shifted very slightly. Clara was Harlan Voss's wife, and she was 26 to Harlan's 51. She had come to him from a prominent family in St. Louis that had fallen on difficult times, and the marriage had been a practical transaction dressed in the language of romance, the kind of arrangement that was more common than people cared to admit in 1880. Clara was not miserable, exactly. She was simply a woman who had traded one kind of cage for another, and she had made a kind of peace with it. What Clara had done in the weeks before everything collapsed was confide in Grant. Not romantically, he was insistent about this, and Della studied his face carefully as he said it and found herself, against her better judgment, believing him. Clara had confided in him because he was quiet and present, and because the other men who worked for Harlan were either loyal to Harlan or too frightened of him to be trusted. She had told Grant that her husband was planning to foreclose on a settlement of Cherokee families who had a legal arrangement with the federal government through an agency agreement, land they had been farming legitimately for 11 years. The legal agreement had a flaw, a minor clerical error in the original filing, and Harlan Voss had found it, and he was going to use it. Grant had tried to stop it. This was the part of the story that had never come out properly, that had been twisted and simplified by the time it traveled the 100 miles from Dodge to Caldwell. He had gone to the federal land agent in Dodge, a man named Pitfield, and told him what he knew. He had given Pitfield enough detail to at least delay the foreclosure while the legal question was examined more carefully. What he had not known was that Pitfield was on Harlan Voss's payroll. Within 48 hours, Voss knew exactly what Grant had done. The version of events that Voss then spread, carefully, through the right circles in Dodge and eventually in every cattle town along the Kishom Trail, was that Grant Bancroft had been working a scheme to steal the Cherokee land for himself by undermining the Meridian claim. It was a lie of breathtaking elegance, because it used the fact of Grant's actions, the visit to Pitfield, the inquiry, to construct a narrative that was the precise inverse of the truth. Voss painted him as a man who had used a desperate woman's confidences to engineer a land grab, and then portrayed Clara as an innocent victim of Grant's manipulation. By the time Grant reached Caldwell in the spring of 1881, the story had preceded him, softened by distance into something vaguer but still malodorous. People in Caldwell did not know the specifics. They knew that Grant Bancroft had left Dodge under something of a cloud. They knew there had been a woman involved. They knew there had been some business about land and a scheme of some kind. It was precisely vague enough to be more damaging than the truth would have been. Grant had come to Caldwell intending to stay only long enough to resupply. He had ended up staying for a year and a half. He had ended up staying because of Della Wells. She was the one who had not looked at him with that particular careful blankness that people adopted when they were trying to appear neutral while actually already having formed a judgment. She had looked at him the way she looked at everyone who walked into the Gold Spur, with a sharp, direct assessment that was neither warm nor cold, just honest. She had poured him a drink, mentioned that if he was looking for work, the Delaney Ranch 3 miles east was hiring hands for the fall gather, and gone back to her bookkeeping without making him feel like a curiosity or a problem. He had taken the work at Delaney's. He had come back to the Gold Spur in the evenings with the other hands. He had started to know her the way you know someone when you see them regularly in a working environment, in fragments and glimpses, the competence with which she managed the room, the way she was fair to the working girls who served tables without being either condescending or blindly lenient, the dry humor she deployed in the tight moments, when a disagreement at the card tables looked like it might become something worse. He had fallen in love with her with a slowness that felt nothing like the word falling, which implied a sudden loss of control. It had felt more like a gradual reorientation, the way a compass needle swings, pulled by something it cannot resist even if it wanted to. For her part, Della remembered all of this differently than he had told it to himself. She had noticed him the way you notice a fire in a cold room, with a wariness that is inseparable from appreciation. She had spent 6 months being careful, telling herself that quiet men with complicated histories were not what she needed in her life. She was running a business. Her father, Thomas Wells, had handed her the management of the Gold Spur 2 years before Grant arrived, when his health had begun to fail him, and she had poured everything she had into it. She did not have room for complicated. And then one night in the October of 1881, a man named Rafe Coulter had decided that the saloon's policy against serving a customer who had already had enough was a personal insult to his dignity, and he had made the kind of scene that could turn dangerous in about 15 seconds. Della had been alone behind the bar, her two regular barmen both sick with the fever that was moving through town that week, and Coulter was big and well past the point of reason. Grant had been sitting at a corner table playing solitaire. He had put down his cards, stood up, walked across the room, and said something very quietly to Rafe Coulter. She had not been able to hear what he said. She never asked him afterward, and he never told her. But Coulter had gone white, and then he had left, and he had been respectful every time he came into the Gold Spur for the rest of the time Della knew him. She had poured Grant a drink she did not charge him for and said, "Thank you." He had said, "It was nothing," and gone back to his solitaire. And she had stood behind the bar and thought with a clarity that surprised her that she was in serious trouble. It had taken another 4 months for either of them to say anything that was not about practical matters or pleasantries. It was March of 1882 when the ice finally broke, and it broke in a way that felt exactly like the river ice breaking on the Arkansas River that ran south of town. Not a dramatic crash, but a slow and inevitable yielding to the pressure of the current underneath. He had stayed behind one evening after the saloon closed, ostensibly to help move a case of whiskey that had arrived late from the freighter. The work took 10 minutes. But the conversation that started while they were moving crates lasted 3 hours, ranging across everything: the territories, the railroad expansion that was reshaping Kansas, what it meant to have grown up in a place that was still inventing its own rules, the particular loneliness of being a person who kept their own counsel in a world that confused silence with weakness. She had told him about her mother, who had died when Della was 12, leaving her to be raised by Thomas Wells in the back rooms of the Gold Spur. She had told him about the complicated gift of that upbringing, the way it had made her practical and competent and slightly mistrustful of sentiment, and the way it had also left her with a hunger for something quieter and more permanent than the nightly theater of a saloon. Grant had listened, and then he had told her about his own mother, a Missouri woman of Scots-Irish descent who had been equally practical and equally unsentimental, and who had raised him alone after his father died, teaching him to fix things and tend livestock and keep his own counsel. It was after midnight when they finished talking. He had stood to go, and at the door he had turned and looked at her across the darkened saloon and said, with the directness that she had come to understand was simply who he was, "I would like to court you properly, if you are willing." She had said, "I'm willing," with the same directness, because she had enough of her father in her to know that dancing around a true thing was a waste of everyone's time. The next 4 months had been the best of her life up to that point. She was 24 and he was 30, and the courtship was the kind that happened between people who were already adults with formed characters, which meant it was less about discovering each other and more about deepening the knowledge that was already taking hold. He took her riding on Sunday afternoons. He accompanied her to the town's small Methodist church, which she attended more out of community loyalty than deep conviction. He was patient with her father, who liked him, but expressed it in the guarded way of a man who had seen too many drifters drift. He brought her wildflowers from the prairie when he came in from a week's work at Delaney's, not with any grand gesture, but simply set them on the bar in a tin cup of water, the way you leave a useful and considered thing. She had loved him. She was not going to deny that to herself now, sitting across this desk from him 2 years later. She had loved him with a completeness that had surprised her, because she had always assumed love was something you had to work at maintaining, like the saloon's roof or the account's ledger. She had not expected it to feel like gravity, like something that simply was. And then Harlan Voss had come to Caldwell. Voss had arrived in July of 1882 with 2 of his associates, a lawyer named Deckard and a man named Trask whose function was purely intimidatory. Voss had taken a room at the Caldwell Hotel, and within 2 days, his real purpose was clear to the people who paid attention to such things. He had come to finalize the acquisition of 3 ranches south of town that he had been maneuvering toward for months through proxy buyers and complicated lease arrangements. He had also, apparently, come to finish what he had started with Grant Bancroft. The first indication Della had was when Deckard the lawyer appeared in the Gold Spur one afternoon and began asking questions. He was clever about it, not asking directly but working around the edges, mentioning Dodge City, mentioning the Cherokee land matter, watching people's faces. Della had served him and answered nothing and sent word to Grant at the Delaney spread. Grant had come into town that evening and found a note tucked into his room at the boarding house where he stayed. The note was from Voss. It was courteous in its language and absolutely clear in its meaning. It told Grant that he was aware Grant had been residing in Caldwell and working at the Delaney operation. It said that Harlan Voss's business dealings in the area were entirely legal, and that Grant's presence in town would make those dealings more complicated than they needed to be, simply because of Grant's known history of interfering in Meridian business. It suggested that Grant might want to consider whether Caldwell was really the best situation for his long-term prospects. It finished by noting that Mr. Voss would hate to see the details of Grant's history in Dodge City become more widely known in Caldwell than they already were. It was a beautifully constructed threat, because it operated in the space where blackmail and simple advice were difficult to distinguish from each other. Grant had sat with that note for a long time. Then he had gone to see Voss at the hotel. What happened in that meeting was something Della had not known, not until this evening. She had known only the version that the town had seen, which was that Grant Bancroft had ridden out of Caldwell 3 days after Harlan Voss arrived, without saying goodbye to her, leaving behind only a note that said he needed to go and that she should not wait for him. The note had been the betrayal. Not his leaving. She could have understood necessity, understood that a man might need to move on. The note. The cold, brief, apologetic few lines that had treated everything between them like something that could be folded up and left on a board house table. She had waited anyway, in the way you wait for something you cannot stop yourself from hoping for, even when hope makes you feel like a fool. She had waited for a month, and then 3 months, and then 6, and then she had taken the waiting and put it somewhere interior and covered it over with work and ordinary days and told herself that was called moving on. It was not moving on. The meeting with Voss, Grant said now, his voice careful and quiet in the amber lamplight. He made me an offer. What kind of offer? He said he would clear the record, formally in writing through Deckard. A signed document withdrawing the accusations from Dodge, acknowledging that the original account of events had been based on incomplete information. He had enough weight in the territory that a document like that would have followed me the way the lie had. It could have been over. Della watched him, and the condition was that I leave Caldwell and not come back. He knew about you. He knew specifically about you. He said that if I stayed, or if I made any trouble about his acquisition of those ranches, the story he'd tell about me would include you. That there would be suggestions, nothing he could be sued for, just suggestions, that my connection to you was part of some plan, that the Gold Spur had been laundering money from stolen land proceeds, something complicated and deniable and impossible to fully disprove. The air in the small room had changed. Della could feel the quality of it against her skin, charged with something between devastation and a sudden, fierce understanding. He threatened the saloon, she said. He threatened you, Grant said. Your reputation, your father's business, your livelihood, everything you'd spent years building. He was prepared to destroy it because you were associated with me. And you left. I left, without telling me. He pressed his lips together. There was something in his expression that was beyond regret. That was the particular anguish of a person who has understood too late that their choice, made in the name of protecting someone, was exactly the kind of choice that person would never want made for them. I thought, he said slowly, that if you didn't know the reason, you wouldn't be tempted to fight it, that you would be angry at me instead of at Voss, that you would move on. You thought wrong, Della said flatly. I know. I needed the truth. I needed you to trust me with it. Instead, you made a decision for me like I was a child who needed to be protected from information about my own life. I know, he said again. Della, I know. That is the thing I have been living with for 2 years. She was quiet for a long moment. She could hear the distant sounds of the saloon behind them, the muffled piano that Abe had apparently resumed playing, the low hum of conversation, the intermittent clink of glasses. The ordinary night proceeding in its ordinary way while something extraordinary was happening in this small back room. Where have you been? She said. Not a question exactly, more like a door left open. He had been working. Moving across the territory, taking cattle work and occasional surveying work, keeping himself useful and solvent and always planning to come back. The plan had kept shifting its timing. He had wanted to come back with the threat of Voss neutralized, because coming back while Voss still had the power to act on his threats would only recreate the original problem. It had taken 18 months and a considerable amount of careful legal work, done through a lawyer in Wichita named Abbott, a man who specialized in land disputes and had professional reasons of his own to be interested in Harlan Voss's methods. Abbott had found, over the course of that work, enough documented evidence of the fraudulent land assessments and the corrupt relationship between Voss and the federal land agent Pitfield to make a formal complaint to the Federal Land Office in Washington. The investigation had taken 6 months. 3 weeks ago, Harlan Voss had been formally stripped of his operating licenses in Kansas and Indian Territory. Deckard the lawyer had resigned his association with the Meridian Company and relocated to St. Louis. Trask had simply disappeared in the way that men of his particular function sometimes did when the operation that employed them collapsed. The Cherokee families south of Dodge, all 11 original households, had been formally confirmed in their land rights, which Grant mentioned quietly and without drama, but which Della could see mattered to him as much as his own exoneration. The threat was gone. The reason he had stayed away had been dismantled, systematically and patiently, across 18 months, and so he had come back. You should have written, she said. Her voice was not as steady as she wanted it to be. I wrote, he said. I wrote 4 letters that I never sent. Grant, I was afraid. She stared at him, you were afraid. That it would be too late, that you would have moved on properly. That I would arrive and find that you had made a life that did not have room for me in it, and that if I had warned you I was coming, you would have had time to fortify yourself against it. I thought if I just came, if I walked in and said it directly, at least you would have the truth before you could decide. Della Wells looked at this man she had loved and lost and grieved and resented, and apparently, infuriatingly, continued to love through all of it, and she said, You are a profound idiot. Something shifted in his face, not quite a smile but adjacent to one. Yes, he agreed, that has been my own assessment. And you rode 400 miles. 412 by the mile markers. For me. For you. She stood up from behind the desk, and the desk stopped being useful as a defense, because she came around it and stopped in front of him the way she had stopped in the main room of the saloon, except this time there was no audience and no performance necessary, just the two of them in lamplight, and she said, There are conditions. He looked up at her and waited. You do not make decisions on my behalf without telling me. Whatever the situation, whatever the threat, you tell me and we decide together. I am not someone who needs to be protected from reality. I am someone who needs a partner. Yes, he said. And if you ever intend to leave again, you say it to my face. Yes, and you are going to have to earn my trust back. Not because I think you are a bad man, I do not think that, but because trust is not something you can explain your way back to. It is something you rebuild through time and action. I understand that, he said. I expected nothing less. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, I need to get back to the bar. He stood. He was close enough that she could see the dust in the fabric of his duster and the tiredness behind his eyes, and the thing behind the tiredness that had been there every time she'd ever looked at him. The quiet, steady, unsurvivable caring. "Can I call on you tomorrow?" he said. "You can call on me at 10 o'clock in the morning," she said. "Bring coffee, the good kind from Sutton's, not the swill from the hotel." He almost smiled again. Sutton's, understood. She went back through the door to the saloon and picked up her place behind the bar and resumed the evening's work as though nothing had happened, except that her hands had stopped shaking, and there was something different in her chest. Not the hollow feeling, not quite yet anything she was willing to name, but the sense of a door that had been sealed shut for a long time standing newly open to the air. The days that followed were not simple. Della had not expected them to be. Grant found lodging at the same boarding house he had occupied before his departure, run by a widow named Mrs. Farber who asked no questions of her tenants and served breakfast at 7:30 regardless of the weather. He appeared at the Gold Spur at 10 the following morning with 2 tin cups of coffee from Sutton's General Store, which was the one establishment in Caldwell that roasted its own beans and brewed coffee of a quality that was almost embarrassingly civilized for a prairie cattle town. They sat at a table by the front window in the morning quiet of the saloon, which did not open until noon, and they talked. They talked about the practical things that needed talking about, what he planned to do for work now that he was back, what his intentions were with regard to staying in Caldwell, what she expected from this period of rebuilding that she had described the previous night. Grant had saved enough from 2 years of cattle work and surveying to be comfortable for several months without employment. He had been thinking, he said carefully, about the possibility of purchasing a small piece of land east of town, where a former homestead was being offered for sale at a reasonable price. The house would need significant repair, but the land was sound and the well had water. He could run a few cattle, do some hire work, and have a place of his own. Della listened to this without commenting until he finished. Then she said, "That is the Hendricks property. The house burned 4 years ago. There is only a foundation." "I know, I would build." She studied him. "You are talking about permanence." "I told you why I came back," he said. "I was not speaking casually." She looked down at her coffee cup and then out the window at the morning street, where 2 boys were chasing a dog and a freight wagon was making its slow way toward the general store, and she thought about permanence, about what it meant and what it required, and about the difference between being afraid of it and being appropriately cautious about it. "I do not rush," she told him. "I know," he said. "I am not asking you to." Their courtship the second time around was different from the first. The first time had been characterized by discovery, by the pleasure of learning someone new. This time they were discovering different things, or discovering the same things more deeply. They were finding out which parts of what they had been to each other were still true, and which parts had been altered by time and experience and absence. It was a process that required more honesty than courtship usually demanded, because they had to talk about the things they had not talked about adequately the first time, the reasons they had held things back, the fears they had been too proud to name. Her father, Thomas Wells, had recovered enough from his illness that he was sometimes seen in the saloon in the evenings, moving slowly but with the dignity of a man who had built something and intended to outlast predictions. He had met Grant's return with the particular reserve that Della recognized as her father's version of careful hope. Thomas had liked Grant the first time. He had been wounded by the leaving, not for his own sake but for his daughter's. He was not quick to set that aside. Grant understood this and was patient with it. He did not try to explain himself to Thomas, did not offer the justifications and context he had offered Della. He simply showed up, consistently, in the small, reliable ways that build trust better than words, helping when help was needed, being present without demanding anything in return. It was about 3 weeks after Grant's return that Thomas came to find him one morning at the boarding house. Grant was on the porch with a cup of coffee, watching the street. Thomas settled into the other porch chair with the careful effort of a man who is managing his body's diminishments without complaint. "My daughter," Thomas said without preamble, "is the most capable person I have ever known. She has run that business through drought and cattle panic and railroad shifts that changed the whole economy of this town. She has never asked for help she did not need and never taken credit she did not earn." "I know," Grant said. "She told me why you left," Thomas said. "All of it." "Voss and the threat and your reasoning." He paused. "I understand the reasoning. I don't entirely forgive the execution, but I understand it." "That's more than I deserve," Grant said. Thomas looked at him with the assessing eyes of a man who had spent 40 years watching people and deciding what they were worth. "It might be exactly what you deserve," he said. "The question is what you do with it." He stood slowly with the assistance of the porch railing. "She is everything to me. You understand that?" "Yes, sir," Grant said. "Don't make me regret letting this proceed. I intend to spend as long as necessary making sure you don't." Thomas nodded, a single, final nod that said more than a speech would have, and went back inside. October came in over the Kansas plains with the particular amber light of the season, the grass turning from green to the color of old wheat, the sky deepening to a blue so saturated it almost hurt to look at. It was the kind of autumn that made the territory beautiful enough that you could forget, temporarily, all the ways it was brutal. Grant had begun the work on the Hendricks Foundation. He had bought the property with a straightforward cash transaction, signed at the land office with the efficiency of a man who had done a great deal of research before arriving at the moment of decision. He hired 2 men who needed the work, brothers named Caldwell, no relation to the town, who were skilled in timber framing and had come through the previous year from Kansas City. They began the structure of the house in September, and by October had the framing up and the roof boards going on. Della came out to see the progress on a Sunday afternoon, riding the bay mare she kept stabled behind the saloon. She stood looking at the skeleton of the house for a long time, at the way it sat on the old foundation, the 4 walls taking shape against the sky, the gap where the front door would be, the squared openings that would eventually hold glass windows. "2 bedrooms," Grant said, standing beside her. "The second one for a study or a guest room or whatever is needed. You planned 2 bedrooms." He was quiet for a beat. "I planned for the possibility that this house would not be lived in alone." She did not say anything to that, but she looked at the house for a while longer with an expression that was not easy to read, but that contained within it something that looked very much like recognition. The way a person looks at a thing they have not seen before but that somehow corresponds to an image they have been carrying in their imagination. She came back the following Sunday, and the Sunday after that. She began to offer opinions, not intrusive ones, not the kind that take over a project, but the considered opinions of a woman with a practical eye and specific ideas about how a house should work. The kitchen needed a window on the east wall for morning light. The front porch should be wide enough for 2 chairs with room to spare. The bedroom would benefit from a second door that opened onto the side yard. Grant incorporated every suggestion without making a ceremony of it, and she noticed that he did, and this noticing did something steady and significant in her chest. The month of November arrived, and with it the first cold. The Caldwell brothers finished the roof and sided the walls. Grant did much of the interior work himself in the evenings, and Della found herself stopping by the property not only on Sundays, but on occasional weekday afternoons, bringing something hot to eat from the kitchen at the saloon, staying to help with smaller tasks, painting window frames, hanging the interior doors, laying the hearthstones of the fireplace that would heat the main room. Working beside him in the growing structure of the house felt like something she had not expected, like an intimacy that was different from conversation and different from the courtship rituals they had been performing, something more like partnership, like the ordinary shared labor that was, she had always believed, the foundation of the kind of love that lasted. They were laying the hearthstones one evening in mid-November, fitting the flat stones that Grant had hauled in from the creek bed into the mortar bed he had prepared, when he said, without looking up from the work, "I have been carrying a question for 3 weeks." "Then ask it," she said, pressing a stone level with the palm of her hand. He sat back on his heels and looked at her. In the lamplight of the half-finished room, with plaster dust on his hands and her hair coming loose from its pins, the moment had a kind of accidental beauty that was more powerful than anything that could have been arranged. "Will you marry me?" he said. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "I was wondering when you were going to get to that. Is that a yes?" "That is a yes," she said. "Obviously it is a yes." He came across the hearthstone toward her, and she met him halfway, and when he kissed her, it was with the thoroughness of a man who had been waiting a very long time for the permission to do so properly. She put her hands on either side of his face and kissed him back with equal thoroughness, and the lamplight swayed in the draught from the unfinished window frame, and the house around them, still smelling of new timber and fresh mortar, felt like the most solid and promising thing in the world. They were married in December on the 20th, in Caldwell's Methodist Church. The ceremony was performed by the Reverend Alcott, who had arrived in town the previous year from Ohio, and who had the admirable quality of being both genuinely devout and genuinely sensible. The church was crowded, because the town of Caldwell had developed a proprietary interest in the resolution of Grant and Della's story, and most of it turned out to witness the ending. Thomas Wells walked his daughter down the aisle slowly, leaning on his cane, and when he gave her hand to Grant, he looked at Grant for a moment over her head with an expression that was the closing of a chapter in a longer story, something complex and final, and filled with a father's love for his child expressed in the only way he knew how to express it, as trust given to another person to carry forward. Della wore a dress of deep green wool that she had commissioned from a seamstress in Wichita, the fabric arriving on the eastbound stage 3 days before the wedding. It was not a white dress, which would have felt theatrical under the circumstances, but it was beautiful in the way that something practical and perfectly suited is beautiful. Her hair was pinned up with care, and there were small dried flowers from the summer's prairie tucked among the pins, goldenrod and wild aster that she had pressed and saved herself, a private thing between herself and the previous season. Grant wore his best clothes, which were not grand but were clean and well-fitted and complemented by a vest of dark-figured wool that Della had found in the mercantile, and presented to him the week before the wedding with the casual generosity of a woman who is already thinking about a life together. He stood at the altar and watched her walk toward him with an expression that anyone in the church who was paying attention could read without difficulty, the absolute, open, uncomplicated love of a man who has arrived at the exact place he needs to be and knows it. The ceremony was brief and meaningful. Reverend Alcott said the traditional words and a few of his own. Grant and Della said the ones required of them and meant each of them entirely. When it was done, and the townspeople pressed forward to offer congratulations, and when Mrs. Farber from the boarding house produced, apparently from nowhere, a remarkable quantity of food that had clearly been prepared in advance and organized with military precision, and when the Gold Spur was given over for the evening to celebration that involved Abe at the piano playing every song he knew that had a celebratory quality, Della found herself standing beside her husband in the middle of the room they had both worked in for so long. And she felt a quality of happiness that was not giddy or frantic but deep and settled and durable, like the new hearthstones, laid level and true. They moved into the house before Christmas. There were still things unfinished, trim that wanted painting, a back porch that existed only as Grant's intention, a kitchen garden that was currently empty frozen earth but would become something else in spring. They moved in anyway because the house was livable and warm and it was theirs, and the unfinished parts of it felt less like incompletion and more like the natural condition of something still becoming. The first morning she woke up in the house, Della lay still for a while in the early gray light, listening to the quality of the silence, which was different from the silence above the saloon where she had slept for years. It was a quieter quiet, a more permanent one. Grant was already awake beside her on his back, looking at the ceiling with the particular expression that meant he was thinking rather than worrying. "What?" she said. "The east pasture fence line needs attention before spring." She laughed. She laughed at the pure ordinariness and rightness of it, at the fact that this was what a morning with this man sounded like, and it was exactly what she had wanted without knowing how to name it. Winter on the Kansas prairie in 1882, going into 1883, was cold and clear and occasionally brutal, with storms that came off the high plains with a speed and violence that could catch the unprepared badly. Grant was not unprepared. He had been reading the sky since childhood, and he had the kind of practical instincts about weather and livestock and land that could not be learned from books. The small herd he had purchased in November, a modest 12 head of good mixed stock, came through the winter without loss, which was not nothing in a Kansas winter. Della continued to manage the Gold Spur, riding into town on most weekday mornings, handling the accounts and the ordering and the daily business with the same capable efficiency she had always brought to it. Her father's health stabilized through the winter, and Thomas himself began to suggest, with increasing frequency and directness, that Della should think about his succession plan for the saloon, by which he meant that he wanted to formalize her ownership before anything happened to him. They sat down with a lawyer in February and worked out the arrangements. Thomas transferred ownership to Della with a small retained interest that would revert to her estate upon his death, which was a legal formality he insisted on because he was not a man who liked loose ends. Della accepted this with the straightforward practicality she brought to most things, and then hugged her father in the way she rarely did, without reservation or self-consciousness, just the full expression of what she felt. Thomas had grumbled in his way and patted her back, and found something very important to look at in the far corner of the ceiling until he had recovered his composure. Spring came. The kitchen garden went in during the last week of April, later than Della had wanted, but the ground was still cold until then, and she was patient about it. She planted onions and root vegetables and the kitchen herbs that made food worth eating, and along the fence line she put in a long run of sunflowers, because she had always thought sunflowers were underappreciated, and the prairie seemed to agree, growing them readily and enthusiastically wherever given the chance. Grant built the back porch in May, working on it in the evenings after the day's ranch work, and when it was done it was exactly as she had asked, wide enough for 2 chairs with room to spare. They sat on it most evenings when the weather allowed, watching the western sky do what Kansas evening skies do, which is to take the light of the setting sun and refract it into colors that have no adequate names and make the whole enormous horizon look like the inside of something divine. It was on the back porch on an evening in early June that Della told him she was pregnant. She did not make a dramatic event of it. She said, in the same tone she used to tell him the east fence needed attention, "I believe we are going to need that second bedroom for something other than a study." He was very still for a moment. Then he turned to look at her, and she saw on his face an expression that she had not seen before, something unguarded and enormous, joy and terror and wonder all at once, the face of a man being handed a responsibility so profound it had rearranged everything in him instantly. "Truly," he said. "Truly," she said. "Early days, but truly." He took her hand, which was on the arm of her chair, and held it with a careful, full intensity that said more than he had words for in the moment. She let him hold it and watched the evening sky and felt, in the body and in the marrow and in whatever part of a person is not strictly anatomical, that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. The pregnancy progressed through summer and into fall. Della continued working at the saloon through the summer months, accepting no reduction in her involvement despite her father's attempts to encourage her to slow down, until the third month when she agreed to delegate more of the evening management to a capable young man named Reuben who had been working the bar for 2 years and had earned her trust. She came in for the mornings, handled the accounts and the ordering, and was home before supper most days. The Caldwell brothers, who had become something like friends through the construction of the house, returned in September to frame an extension off the back, adding a proper third bedroom to what Grant had originally built, because it had become apparent, as the pregnancy progressed and the subject came up in conversation, that 2 children was a number both of them were quietly imagining. The baby came in January of 1884, arriving after a labor that was hard and long, attended by the town's doctor, a steady-handed man named Fletcher who had trained in Philadelphia and come west for reasons he never fully explained but who was very good at his work. Grant sat outside the bedroom door for most of the night, not pacing because pacing was not in his nature, but present with an absolute, focused stillness that Mrs. Farber, who had come to help, later described as the most anxious and controlled thing she had ever witnessed in another human being. The baby was a boy. They named him Thomas for the obvious reason. Thomas Wells Bancroft, who arrived in the world with dark hair and gray eyes and an immediate sense of his own opinion about everything, including the temperature of the room and the question of whether sufficient attention was being paid to him at any given moment. Thomas Wells Sr. cried when he met his grandson. He did so with his back turned, looking at the window, but the shaking of his shoulders was visible, and neither Della nor Grant mentioned it, which was the most respectful thing they could have done. The second year in the house was a different quality of life from the first. It was fuller, in the sense of more noise and more presence and the particular weight and warmth of an infant in the house, who became in the spring a crawling, and then a pulling up to standing, and then a very determined walking presence whose interest in every object within reach was total and exhausting and wonderful. Grant adapted to fatherhood with the same quiet completeness that characterized everything he did. He was not effusive or performative about it. He was simply there entirely in the way that young Thomas needed him to be, holding, rocking, walking the floor on bad nights without complaint, learning the particular language of a child who did not yet have words, understanding what the different cries meant, what the specific expression of his son's face communicated. Della watched this and loved him for it with a steadiness that had nothing to do with courtship or romantic urgency, and everything to do with the kind of love that is built from observation over time, from seeing who a person is when they are not performing anything. Thomas Wells Sr. passed away in the summer of 1885, in the evening quietly, which was how he had always done everything that mattered. He had been declining slowly for months, and the decline had been managed with grace and without complaint, which was entirely in character. He died in the room above the Gold Spur where he had lived for 30 years, with Della at his bedside holding his hand, and the saloon below them silent because Reuben had closed it for the evening when word came that Thomas was near the end. Grant came and sat with Della through the night. He said almost nothing, because nothing that could be said was adequate to the occasion, but his presence was complete and solid beside her, and when she finally cried in the gray hour before dawn, he held her without trying to fix the grief or hurry it or translate it into something more manageable. He simply held her and let the grief be what it was. She had told him once, in those early morning conversations in the saloon back in 1882, that she found comfort less in being consoled and more in being accompanied, that a person willing to simply stay in the difficult feeling alongside her was worth more than any number of reassurances. He had remembered this. He had applied it in the most necessary moment she had offered him. It was, she thought later, the truest possible expression of having been completely heard. The saloon, fully hers now by both legal arrangement and inheritance, went through a period of considered change in the following year. The railroad had shifted the cattle drives, and Caldwell's particular character as a terminal point was evolving. The nature of the clientele was changing as the territory settled, as more families came and fewer of the pure cowboy culture that had defined the town in its heyday remained. Della read these changes accurately, which she had always been good at, and adapted the Gold Spur accordingly. She reduced the gambling tables by one, and used the space to install a proper dining area with 4 tables and a kitchen access that served the best meals in Caldwell, which was not difficult to achieve given the competition, but which she took seriously anyway. She hired a cook, a black woman named Hattie Johnson, who had been cooking for a cattle camp outfit, and who had a talent that was frankly wasted on trail food. The dining addition transformed the Gold Spur's character in ways that expanded its clientele without abandoning its original one, which was good business and also, Della felt, a better version of what the place could be. In the fall of 1885, she found herself in conversation with a group of women who had organized themselves into a loose civic association, concerned with the conditions facing the families of Chinese railroad workers who had remained in the area after the construction crews moved on. It was not a conversation she had expected to have, but the need was real. The families were there. They had children who were excluded from the town school by a policy that Della found, when she examined it directly, to be indefensible by any logic except prejudice. She joined the association and brought to it the same practical energy she brought to everything, not speeches or outrage but specific actions, conversations with the school board, a direct and unornamental argument based on the observable facts that children who were excluded from education became adults who had fewer options, and that a town with adults who had fewer options was a worse town for everyone in it. It took 2 years. The school board changed its policy in 1887, which was not fast and was not easy, but it happened, and Della never made a great deal of noise about her role in it, which was also entirely in character. Grant expanded the ranch during these same years, gradually and without overreach, adding to the herd carefully and improving the grazing management in ways that kept the land from the degradation he had seen on overgrazed ranges elsewhere. He was not a man trying to build an empire. He was a man trying to build something that would still be good in 20 years, which was a different and less glamorous ambition that produced, over time, far better results. He hired 2 men permanently, a former army man named Whitaker and a younger hand named Pedro who had come up from Texas with a cattle drive and decided that Kansas offered better prospects than the return journey. Grant was a fair employer in the direct, non-patronizing sense, which meant he paid honest wages, asked hard work and got it, and treated the men as the capable adults they were. The second child arrived in the spring of 1887, a girl this time, whom they named after Della's mother, Margaret. Margaret Bancroft came into the world with a set of opinions that she expressed at considerable volume, and an energy that, as she developed into a toddler and then a small, determined person, reminded everyone who knew Della of Della at the same stage, which Thomas Jr., who was 3 and had opinions of his own, found both fascinating and occasionally frustrating. The Bancroft household was, by the fall of 1887, a full and complicated and genuinely happy place. Mornings were organized chaos, breakfasts prepared and consumed, Thomas off to school with the other Caldwell children, Margaret managing the world with her characteristic determination, Grant out to the range by sunrise and back before supper. Evenings on the back porch when the season allowed. The ordinary, extraordinary accumulation of days that makes up a life. But life in the Wild West in 1887 was not without its moments of crisis, and the next one came from a direction Della had not anticipated. A man arrived in Caldwell in October of that year, presenting himself to the land office as a representative of a railroad company that was considering a spur line through the area. He was polished, well-dressed, persuasive, and he was quietly approaching landowners in the area about easements and right-of-way purchases. His name was Farley, and he had a practiced charm that Della recognized as a professional tool rather than a personal quality. Grant came home from town one evening with a look that she had learned to read, the particular quality of stillness that meant he had encountered something that required careful thought. "Farley," she said, not a question. He looked at her. "He came to the ranch today. He's been in the saloon twice this week. What did he want?" "He says the railroad wants a right-of-way through the east pasture. The route they're considering would take the fence line and about 12 acres of the good grazing land." "What company?" "He named one I've never heard of, Pacific Western Transit." "I have not heard of it either," Della said, "and I know the names of the lines that are active in Kansas. There is no Pacific Western Transit." Grant nodded slowly. "No, there isn't." The investigation that followed was conducted quietly, and with the help of Abbott, the Wichita lawyer who had been so useful in the Voss matter, and who had since become a general legal advisor to the Bancroft family. Abbott's inquiries revealed within 2 weeks that Pacific Western Transit was a paper company with no railroad charter, no capital backing, and no connection to any legitimate railroad operation. It was a scheme for acquiring land options from farmers and ranchers who believed they were dealing with a railroad, options that could then be sold to actual developers or speculators at a considerable margin. Farley was not Harlan Voss. He was smaller and less dangerous and primarily motivated by money rather than malice. But the scheme was real, and there were 8 other families in the area who had already signed option agreements in good faith. Grant and Della brought the information to the county sheriff, a methodical man named Dobbins who had served in Caldwell for 6 years and had a nose for when a clean-looking situation smelled wrong. Dobbins investigated, confirmed Abbott's findings, and arrested Farley on a fraud charge. The option agreements were voided through the court. The 8 families got their land back free of encumbrance. Farley spent 2 years in the county jail, which was not nothing but was also not the most dramatic resolution. The whole episode was resolved in a few weeks of careful, unglamorous legal work, which was how most genuine threats were best resolved, not through confrontation and gunplay, but through the slow, reliable machinery of evidence and law. Caldwell continued to evolve through the late 1880s. The cattle drives had largely moved on, following the railroad lines south and west. The town was settling into a different kind of existence, more agricultural, more permanent, less spectacular but more stable. Businesses that had depended on the transient cowboy economy closed or transformed. The ones that survived did so because they had adapted to serve a community that was putting down roots rather than passing through. The Gold Spur survived and flourished because Della had been adapting it all along. By 1888, it was as much a restaurant and social gathering place as it was a saloon, serving the community in ways that reflected what the community had become. She kept the bar because it was part of what the Gold Spur was, and because people needed places to gather. But the character of the establishment had mellowed into something that felt less like a frontier institution and more like the kind of place that would still be there in 50 years. Grant's ranch by 1888 was running close to 100 head, which was not a cattle empire, but was a solid, well-managed operation that generated an honest living and was not in danger of overextension. He had a reputation in the area as a fair man and a careful rancher, which were exactly the reputations he had been building toward without making a great production of the building. Thomas Jr., at 5, was learning to ride under his father's supervision, with a seriousness of purpose that was entirely characteristic of him. Margaret, at 2.5, watched her brother's lessons from the fence with an expression that made it abundantly clear that she was filing information away for future use. One evening in late fall, Della was sitting on the back porch watching the sunset perform its nightly extravagance over the western horizon when Grant came and sat beside her. They were quiet for a while in the comfortable way that people are quiet when they have built a life together that is large enough to be shared easily without either of them needing to fill the space. "Do you remember," he said, after a while, "the first morning you told me I was a profound idiot?" She considered this. "You have given me several mornings to choose from. The night I came back, in the back room, I remember. I have thought about that night a great deal," he said, "about how close it was if you had said it was too late, if you had meant it when you said you were fine." "I did mean it," she said. "I was fine, I would have continued to be fine." "I know," he said. "That is the part that was terrifying. That you were genuinely fine and you didn't need me, and I came back anyway, and asked you to choose something that wasn't necessary for your survival." She looked at him. "Necessary for survival and necessary for a full life are not the same thing," she said. "I was fine. I was not full. There is a difference." He was quiet, absorbing this. "And I chose it," she said. "Both times I chose it with my eyes open, knowing who you were and what you had done and why you had done it and what it would require of us. I chose it because the choosing was true, not because I needed rescuing." "No," he said. "You were never someone who needed rescuing." "No," she agreed. "But I needed a partner, and you are that." The sunset was extraordinary, even by Kansas standards. The light was the deep orange of banked coals, and it lay across the dry grass of the late fall range like something precious, making ordinary things glow. "I want to ask you something," he said. "Then ask. Are you happy? Truly? Not fine, not managing, not making the best of things. Happy." She thought about it honestly, which was the kind of question that deserved honesty and not the reflexive reassurance that was always easier to offer. She thought about the mornings, the work at the saloon, the evenings on the porch, the children who were upstairs sleeping with the complete abandonment of the very young, her father's grave in the churchyard where she placed flowers when the season offered them, the house that had been built on an old foundation and was now entirely itself. She thought about the man beside her, who had ridden 412 miles and walked into the Gold Spur and said 7 words that had changed everything, and who had been in the 1,000 and more days since, every day, exactly who he had presented himself to be. "Yes," she said. "Genuinely, completely, without reservation. Yes." He reached across and took her hand, the way he had on the porch the evening she told him about the baby, with that full and careful intensity that was its own language. "Good," he said. They sat until the last light faded and the stars came out over the Kansas plains, thick and brilliant in the way they only appear when you are far enough from town to see them properly. And the night was cold and clear, and the world was the particular size it is when you are sitting outside under an enormous sky in a country that is still, even after all the changes and all the years, fundamentally wild. In the spring of 1889, Della discovered she was pregnant for the 3rd time. She told Grant on the back porch in the evening, which had become the place where significant things were said between them, as though the open sky gave them room to be large. He was not still this time. This time when she told him, he laughed, a full, genuine, unrestrained laugh that she had heard from him occasionally over the years, and that was always remarkable precisely because it was not his usual register. The laugh startled her, and then she laughed too at the surprise of his reaction and at the pure, uncomplicated delight in it. "3," he said. "3," she confirmed. "The porch needs to be bigger," he said. She laughed again. "The porch is fine." "I am going to build a swing for the porch," he said firmly, "this fall before the baby comes. You are not going to build a porch swing." "I absolutely am." He built the porch swing in August, with the same deliberateness he brought to everything, choosing the wood carefully, constructing it over the course of 2 weeks in the evenings after ranch work, hanging it on well-forged chains that would last without complaint for as long as the porch stood. It was a good swing. It had room for 2 adults comfortably, or 1 adult and 2 children, or various configurations of family that a back porch would, over the years, be called upon to accommodate. The 3rd baby arrived in November of 1889, another boy, whom they named James after no one in particular, but because it was a solid, uncomplicated name that suited a person well and placed no expectations on him. James arrived with dark eyes and a calm temperament that was unlike his siblings, and which caused his father, in the quieter moments of the first weeks, to hold him in the lamplight and look at him with the expression of a man being given something he had not known to wish for. By 1890, the Bancroft household was full in every sense of the word. Thomas Jr. was 7 and insatiably curious about everything mechanical and natural that came within his range of investigation. Margaret was 5 and had developed the precise, efficient personality of a person who was going to be formidable in any room she entered for the rest of her life. James was a toddling, cheerful presence who had the gift of making the people around him feel at ease, which was not a small gift. Grant had by this point taken on a role in the county's informal land management discussions, contributing the practical knowledge of a working rancher to conversations about water rights and grazing boundaries that were increasingly important as the territory filled in. He was not a political man by nature, but he was a man who understood land and was trusted because he said only what he believed to be true, which made him useful in contexts where a great deal of what was said was the other thing. Della had expanded the Gold Spur's kitchen operation to supply prepared meals to 2 of the other businesses in town that had asked for it, an arrangement that was profitable, and that Hattie Johnson, now the head of a small kitchen staff, had managed into something she was clearly proud of. The Gold Spur at the start of the new decade was an institution in Caldwell in the way that only things which have served their community honestly for a long time become, carrying the accumulated weight of all the ordinary and extraordinary evenings that had happened within its walls. On a Sunday afternoon in the early summer of 1890, Della brought the children to the saloon to show Thomas how the accounts worked, because he was 7 and interested in how things functioned, and because she had learned from her own childhood that understanding the mechanics of a working life was the most practical gift a parent could offer. Thomas sat very seriously at the desk in the back room, looking at the ledger pages with the same focused attention his father brought to things, while Margaret explored the kitchen with Hattie's tolerant permission and James sat on the bar and ate a piece of peppermint candy with deep concentration. Grant had ridden in separately and was at the bar with a coffee, watching his son at the desk through the open office door. He was quiet in the way he was always quiet, present without making a show of it. Della came and stood beside him and followed his gaze to Thomas, who had now picked up a pencil and was apparently calculating something. "He is going to be better at this than me," she said. "He has the same head for it," Grant said. "But yes, better." She considered Thomas at the desk, this boy who was theirs, who had her precision and his steadiness, and who was apparently already discovering the satisfaction of a column of figures that balanced. "Are you still glad you came back?" she said. It was not a worried question. It was the question of a person who wanted to say the true thing out loud, to acknowledge the whole of it. He looked at her with the gray eyes that she had tried and failed to forget for 730 days. "Every day," he said, "every single day." The summer was long and warm and good, the kind of Kansas summer that reminds you of why people came here, why they stayed, why the difficulty was worth it. The grass grew and the cattle fattened and the kitchen garden produced beyond anything Della had anticipated, requiring the construction of a root cellar in August that Grant and Whitaker dug over 2 weekends and lined with stone in the evenings after supper. The swing on the back porch got its use through those long summer evenings. Thomas Jr. had claimed it as a reading location. Margaret used it as a performance stage. James mostly used it as a launching point for adventures in the yard that were monitored at a distance by Whitaker's sheepdog, a patient animal who had appointed himself unofficial custodian of small Bancroft children. In the evenings when the children were in bed and the yard was quiet, Della and Grant sat on the porch together in the particular companionate piece of people who have weathered significant things and come through to the other side. They talked, sometimes at length and sometimes barely at all, about the ranch and the saloon and the children and the news that came in on the stage and the railroad, about the territory's movement toward statehood, about what Caldwell would look like in 20 years, and what role they wanted to play in the shape of it. They also sometimes simply sat and did not talk, listening to the night sounds of the Kansas prairie, the wind in the dry grass, the far-off coyotes, the deep impenetrable silence between those sounds that was neither empty nor lonely but full of the particular weight of a landscape that was older than anyone's presence in it. In the fall of 1890, Grant proposed something that had been forming in his mind for several months. He had been in correspondence with a man in Wichita, a former Army surveyor named Colonel Reeves, who had assembled a coalition of Kansas ranchers to address, formally, and through a set of proposed county ordinances, the question of unregulated water use from the shared waterways in the area. The issue was not dramatic, but it was consequential, because the pattern of water use that was developing as the territory filled in was one that would, if allowed to continue unchecked, produce serious shortages within a decade. Reeves had asked Grant to come to Wichita for a 3-day meeting of the coalition to help draft the ordinance language. Grant had agreed and then had come home and told Della about it and then had waited for her response. She had thought about it for a day and then said, "You should go, take Thomas. He is old enough to see how that kind of meeting works and he will remember it." Grant had looked at her with a particular expression, part surprise and part recognition. "You are sure?" "I am not sure it will work," she said practically. "The ordinance process is slow, and there will be political opposition from the larger operators who benefit from the current arrangement. But the principle is sound and the effort is worth making. And yes, take Thomas." He had taken Thomas, who was 7 and serious and who sat through 2 days of meetings in Wichita with the attentiveness of a much older person, asking questions on the 3rd day that impressed Reeves and the other coalition members and made Grant quietly proud in the understated way that was his natural register. The ordinance process took, as Della had predicted, most of a year. The final version passed the county in the spring of 1891, not intact but workable, a compromise that preserved the principle of shared water rights while creating a monitoring mechanism that could be improved over time. It was not everything Reeves had hoped for. It was enough to matter. The years accumulated. 1891, 1892. The children grew with the determined momentum of the young. Thomas Jr. grew into a boy and then a young person of substance and curiosity who was clearly going to be something particular in the world, though what exactly was still taking shape. Margaret grew into herself with a clarity and force of personality that reminded everyone of her mother and added things of her own that were entirely original. James grew in his own quieter, more observational way, watching the world with those dark eyes and building an internal model of it that occasionally produced observations of remarkable accuracy. Della's work at the Gold Spur evolved with the town and the decade. By 1892, it was less a saloon in the traditional sense and more a community gathering place that also served drinks, which was a subtle but important distinction that reflected how Caldwell itself had changed. The frontier character of the town was becoming history rather than present reality. The men who came through now were more likely to be settlers and small businessmen and families than the cowboys and drifters who had defined the place in its earlier years. She did not mourn the change. She had never been particularly romantic about the frontier character of her childhood. She had grown up in it, and it had shaped her, and she had genuine appreciation for what it had produced. But she also understood that settled communities with schools and churches and functioning legal systems were better for most people, particularly for the people who had always been most vulnerable to the lawlessness that the frontier character also included. Grant turned 40 in 1892. Della organized a supper that was not intended to be a surprise, but that produced from various corners of their lives a collection of people whose presence amounted to a quiet accounting of what the years had built. The Caldwell brothers came, now running their own construction business in town. Abbott the lawyer came down from Wichita. Reuben, who now effectively managed the Gold Spur's daily operations, was there. Whitaker and his wife, who had arrived the previous year from Virginia with a forthright personality that had immediately made her a fixture in the social life of the Bancroft household. Colonel Reeves, who had become a genuine friend through the water rights work. Hattie Johnson and her husband, who had come back to Kansas after years elsewhere and who had become, along with Hattie's kitchen, one of the things that made the Gold Spur what it was. It was a room full of people that two people had gathered to themselves over the course of a decade by being consistently worth knowing, and Grant sat at the head of the table that Della had extended with two borrowed tables to fit everyone, looking at the room with the expression he rarely wore outside of certain private moments, the full, open, undefended version of himself. He stood and said in the quiet that came when people noticed he was about to speak, "I am going to say one thing and then we are going to eat." The room waited. 10 years ago I walked into a saloon in Caldwell and someone looked at me without deciding who I was in advance. That was the thing that changed everything. I have not said that clearly enough. That is the thing. He looked at Della. The rest followed from that. She met his eyes across the table and said nothing, because nothing was necessary, and the room went into the warmth and noise of a good supper among people who were glad to be there. By the fall of 1893, with Thomas Jr. at 10 years old and Margaret at 8 and James at 4, and the ranch running steady and the Gold Spur in reliable good hands, and the house on the old Hendricks foundation fully itself, expanded and repaired and lived in, and carrying in every room the accumulated evidence of the family that had made it, Della and Grant had arrived at a life that was, in all the ways that actually counted, exactly what they had been building toward. There were still difficult things. There were always difficult things in any life honestly lived. Grant had a winter illness in 1893 that kept him in bed for 2 weeks and frightened Della in ways that she acknowledged only to herself, sitting beside him in the evenings and reading aloud from the newspaper in a steady, calm voice, while her hands gripped the paper just slightly too hard. He recovered fully. She did not discuss with him how frightened she had been, but he seemed to know it, in the way he had always known things about her that she had not said, and he was careful for a while after that in the way of a man who understands that the people who love him have a stake in his well-being that he owes them consideration for. The saloon needed a new roof in 1894. The expense was significant but manageable. Reuben managed the disruption of the reconstruction with a competence that confirmed Della's assessment of him as someone she could trust the place to entirely if she chose to. She did not choose to, because she was not ready to stop working, but she filed the confirmation of his ability away as something useful to know. Grant had Thomas Jr. working on the ranch on weekends by 1894, real work rather than supervised learning exercises, and Thomas took to it with a natural capability that settled the question of whether the ranch might eventually pass to someone who would understand what had been built. Margaret, meanwhile, had taken it upon herself to learn everything Della would teach her about the accounts and the business operations, approaching the subject with an intensity that suggested she was storing information for future use. James, at 5, had started school and was discovering, to his teacher's reported astonishment, that he had an extraordinary memory for anything that rhymed or had a rhythm, which was less useful for arithmetic than for the songs and poems he had apparently already catalogued in his head in impressive quantity. The family they had made was real and particular, and shaped by every choice and every difficulty, and every ordinary evening on the back porch, and every morning over Sutton's coffee, and every year of work and presence and deliberate choosing. On the evening of their 12th wedding anniversary, December of 1894, Della and Grant sat alone on the back porch swing in the cold, bundled against the winter in heavy coats, with the children asleep inside and the Kansas sky above them doing nothing special except being itself, vast and dark and salted with stars. "I think about that note," Della said, which was not something she had said in years. "The one you left. When you went." He was quiet. "Not with pain anymore," she said. "I want to be clear about that. I think about it the way you think about the thing that almost went wrong when you are somewhere safe and can afford to acknowledge how close it was." "I think about it too," he said. "What do you think when you think about it?" He considered it for a moment. "I think about who I was then, the particular kind of fear that looks like practicality. The way I convinced myself that leaving without explanation was the protective thing, when it was actually just the thing I could do without having to see the cost of it on your face." "Yes," she said. "I think about what I would have missed," he said. "If you had said it was too late, if I had convinced myself before I came back that it probably was." He paused. All of this. All of this was the house and the children and the ranch and the years and the 1,000 small things and the few enormous ones and the life they had built in this particular corner of the Kansas plain. "I am glad you were brave enough," she said. "Coming back, that was brave." "You were braver," he said, opening the door. She leaned against him on the swing and he put his arm around her and they sat there in the December cold under the enormous sky. And the swing moved slightly in the wind that came off the plain, and the stars were very bright, and the world in that moment, in that specific ordinary extraordinary moment, was exactly the size it should be. In the years that followed they would have more of what they already had, more seasons and more small crises and more ordinary days and more evenings on the porch and more mornings over coffee, and more of the children growing and becoming. Thomas Jr. eventually taking over the management of the ranch with a quiet competence that was entirely his own. Margaret eventually doing something with accounting and business that surprised no one who had been paying attention. James eventually discovering that his gift for language and pattern served him in ways that were still unfolding when the story of his parents' life was already long enough to be remarkable. But the story was already complete in its essential shape, had been complete since the night a man walked into a saloon with trail dust on his coat and found the woman he had ridden 412 miles for and said 7 words that changed everything. 7 words that were not actually 7 words at all, but were in fact the beginning of a very long sentence that took a lifetime to finish, and that, when you read it fully, said, "I came back for you because you are the fixed point by which I navigate, the reason I made myself better, the person whose assessment of me matters more than any other, the one in the world with whom I want to share the mornings and the evenings and the difficult years and the good ones, because a life is larger and truer when you live it alongside someone who knows you completely and chooses you anyway." He had said it in 7 words in the middle of the Gold Spur Saloon in Caldwell, Kansas, in the fall of 1882, while the piano player kept his hands in his lap and the room held its breath. She had heard all of it. She had said yes, and the rest had been exactly what they made of it.